Okay, for this writing workshop, let's tackle a little bit of synthesis and take a look at SpongeBob SquarePants. So the genesis for this essay is kind of interesting. I teach the gamut, 9 through 12, and synthesis is something that for a long time in my district was neglected at the lower grade levels, actually kind of across the curriculum. It wasn't taught that widely. And as we know, when our students transition to college, I'd say, based on my experience of teaching in the university college level, 9/10 of what the students write is synthesis. So I've been making a plea in my district and to anybody who will hear me to teach more synthesis, argument, and persuasion at the secondary level. So this is an essay that we do with our 9th and 10th graders to teach the fundamentals of synthesis. But as you see, as I'll work through this workshop, you easily could use this with juniors and seniors depending on their skill level and where they're at. So this is more of a introduction to the basic premises of writing synthesis. So as always, one of the things I talk about is the need to Bob Ross your instruction. In order for these templates to make sense to your students, you cannot just talk about them pie in the sky in the ether. You're going to have to literally show them how to manipulate these and, like Bob Ross, paint with your students. So let me qualify what I mean by that. So if Bob Ross comes onto the screen and says, "Happy little people, today we are going to paint a beautiful New England autumnal landscape with beautiful fall foliage. And in the center of our canvas, we're going to include a New England wood-covered bridge." Like, Bob doesn't disappear from the screen. He sits there and he paints with us using one template. The guy has one template, one heuristic, the wet on wet technique. Every single time he paints, he uses that template, he uses that heuristic, and our modeling is going to be the same for our students. Whether we're writing an essay about Hamlet, Lord of the Flies, or SpongeBob, we're going to sit at our canvas and paint with them and say, here are a few examples of how to do the introductory paragraph. In these two I inverted, in these two I declared. You've seen it 4 times. Now write your introduction, right? So it demystifies the writing process if we are positioning ourselves as the experts in the classroom, the expert writers that the students will follow. We set the lead, they follow. So here's the prompt for this particular essay. So for synthesis, argument, and persuasion, you usually need to start with a question, right? Because you're engaging in argumentation. So it's very similar to Plato's Republic. What is justice? You need some like girthy topic, some girthy question that is worthy of debate. So, does SpongeBob SquarePants have any pedagogical merit for its intended age demographic? So, here's what I did to set this up. So, for homework, and my students loved this homework assignment, I said, you need to go home and watch 2 episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants. And they were like, what? Mr. Kuhn, what are you saying? I'm like, yeah, it's going to be your primary source. So, the 2 episodes you watch are going to serve as primary sources. And then what we had them do was I located 3 sources, one that answered this yes, an article that said no, and an article that rode the fence that qualified it. So the students started with 3 sources that I found for them. They needed to find 2 to 3 other sources on their own to help them defend, qualify, challenge, or refute the position that they're going, the direction that they're going in. So they have plenty of articles to synthesize. So again, let's make sure we Bob Ross this, and I'll show you how I would do it. So the immediate question is, as we move into the templates and the heuristics, is how do I construct the introductory paragraph? And as always, you can declare or invert. So let's unpack what I mean by that. Always, when I introduce the templates and the heuristics to the students, I give them some pretty tight parameters. And here's the reason why. If we leave students to their own devices, we get things like this, and I'm sure you've seen this in your career. We'll get the 14 sentence long introduction that doesn't even have a thesis statement. It just goes on and on and on, and they start talking about the episodes, they start analyzing the source material, they're quoting, they're paraphrasing, all sorts of things that typically don't occur in an introduction. Or you'll get the one sentence introduction that just dumps a whole bunch of literary terms in your lap or something of that nature. So I tell my students, I want your introductory paragraph to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less, exactly 4 sentences. I think that's plenty of space to achieve what needs to be achieved in terms of establishing a thesis statement, and provides enough space for them to have the appropriate context and background. So if we go back to our essential question, so does SpongeBob SquarePants have any pedagogical merit for its intended age demographic? An easy way for your struggling and emerging writers to begin is to declare the thesis. Just boom, answer the question right out of the gate. Yes or no, or it depends. You can qualify it. So just situate yourself in the thesis immediately, as succinctly, as precisely as possible. That's why it's called declarative, because the student needs to declare. From there, the remaining 3 sentences is going to be context and background. And as always, we want to focus on nuance. So we're going to make sure that the students have a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary. We want them to sound academic. So that nice teeter-totter balance of the colloquial, the vernacular, and the academic. And by tier 2 vocabulary, I just mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level word. And then the other things that we want our students to focus on are those sentence constructs. All too often with our struggling, emerging writers, they go short, simple, declarative sentence, short, simple, declarative sentence, short, simple, declarative sentence. So we want them to be able to manipulate, as Strunk and White say in their book, Write It Right, that there are 12 different ways to write a sentence. This is one of the things I teach my students a lot how to do, is to manipulate their syntax. So I want to see good, varied sentences to achieve rhythm, flow, and voice. So we'll see in my samples my students do that, hopefully. So the flip of the declarative is the inverted, and with this, you start with context and background. Sometimes teachers want their students to start with a hook or an analogy. I think that's really difficult for a lot of students to pull off. So I'm fine with just context and background. And as you funnel it down towards the 4th sentence, you drop the thesis last. So typically what you're going to see in synthesis is a 50-50 split. So some students are half of your students are going to declare, half your students are going to invert. My students found, based on my modeling, based on my Bob Rossing, that when I wrote, I found it easier to invert than to declare on this. And that's where modeling and Bob Rossing comes into play, comes into great effect, is that I told my students I actually had a hard time declaring. It was easier to invert. So you're going to see in my student samples that most of them inverted. They followed my lead. It just really didn't, the question, the essential question doesn't lend itself perfectly to declare. But again, like your real struggling writer, your really emerging writer, to get them out of the gate, just have them declare it. It's the easiest way to go. So here is our first sample. Continually watching SpongeBob SquarePants impairs a child's ability to focus, learn, and mature. So they're starting with context and background. Again, you don't need an analogy, you don't need a hook, right? You don't need to, try anything poetic, just be direct. The inappropriate jokes in SpongeBob expose young children to words, innuendos, and visuals they should not see or hear at such a young age. From a cognitive and social level, the show does not meet the learning needs of the intended age demographic and is inappropriate pedagogically, socially, and behaviorally. So we know the direction that the thesis is going. But in the last sentence, let's hammer it so that we have a nice, good inverted thesis. Additionally, the show is completely non-educational. It even decreases the attention spans and problem-solving abilities of children. So that's all achieved in 4 sentences, and it's a very clearly articulated thesis statement. Note the tier 2 level vocabulary and note those sentence constructs. So yes, your ninth and 10th graders can write to this level of clarity. All right, it can be taught. So you just have to Bob Ross it. So that one out of the gate, that student's off to a blazing good start. Very clearly articulated thesis statement. Here's another one. SpongeBob SquarePants embodies the moral lessons that are crucial to a child's development. The show and its characters have a positive influence on today's youth. They encourage the values of hard work, amiability, and determination. These are values that we want at the foundational core of every child. Unquestionably, so we're going to answer the essential question in the last sentence because we're inverting. Unquestionably, the animation is a perfect show for the appropriate age demographic. So you can see here, students are going to go in a lot of different directions here. This is actually kind of an animated question, and it's rife for a healthy Socratic seminar in your classroom, which we did with our students. We had a great Socratic seminar about this, and students were all into it. So they have many opinions about SpongeBob, something that they all grew up watching. So here's one more. SpongeBob SquarePants promotes erratic and flawed behavior. Little white lies, wasting food, inappropriate movements, and being all around annoying is not role model behavior for children. Given what is offered as programming that targets young children, there are so many other options that are far less detrimental. If parents care about the well-being and moral development of their children, they should not allow their kids to view this program. So you can see here, 3 for 3 done with the inverted template. It just seemed to be, I don't know, a logical way to proceed through this. So sure, a kid could easily start their paper and say, SpongeBob SquarePants has no pedagogical merit whatsoever, and parents should ban it from the airways, right? So a kid could start that way if they are inclined to, and definitely if a student is looking at their blank sheet of paper or their blank screen and they shrug their shoulders and say, Mr. Kuhn, I don't know how to begin. Well, that's the easiest way to troubleshoot that and to get them unstuck is to declare the thesis. But we found it was more skillful to invert. So here's one last one. SpongeBob's endless positivity and work ethic could not provide children with a better show to watch. SpongeBob implants realistic means of achieving success into young viewers' minds and provides them with a solid moral foundation built for success. While SpongeBob is fast-paced and intense, there's no scientific evidence that a television program can elicit ADHD in a child. For our kids to learn valuable life lessons, this is one show parents can trust to advance their good parenting. So that's fine. One thing that you're seeing here in terms of nuance, do you see how the first sentence and the second sentence both begin SpongeBob? So SpongeBob, SpongeBob. That's something I don't like to see in my students' writing. I don't like to have any parallelism at all in the sentence constructs. And you can see a slight reliance on the short, simple declarative sentence in this. So as the student is going to revise, those are some things that I would point out to them. But it is a good inverted thesis nonetheless. They're manipulating the template to yield and produce a thesis statement that is pretty solid, so it's not too bad. So as we move on to the body paragraphs, let's revisit the syllogistic method and hone in on this and just have a reminder of how we're going to manipulate the syllogism to construct the body paragraphs. So all the syllogism is when you are arguing from premise to conclusion. So I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, in premise 1, I state arsenic is deadly. And in the second premise, I say my dog ate arsenic. in the conclusion, we're going to draw a natural line of reasoning that says my dog is going to die. So when students write, we want them to be that cogent in their thinking, right? We in like the College Board calls it the line of reasoning, and I call it the line of reasoning in any of my classes. So we want the students' line of reasoning to be very tight and compact and focused, very logical. And when they write syllogistically, if they can manipulate the template correctly and adhere to that logical progression of, arsenic is deadly, my dog ate arsenic, my dog is going to die. If they can be that bulletproof in their line of reasoning when they write, then it's going to bode very well for them. All too often we see, though, especially if we take a look at College Board writing, on the language exam is where you'll find synthesis. Oftentimes students will only present the second premise, which when I read it, it reads like a regurgitation of the sources. They're just kind of chewing the sources and spitting them back out and not saying anything original at all. There's not even really necessarily an argument in it. It's just sort of a summation of the source material, and that's not what we want. So we have to argue from start to finish in this. So if we break down how to manipulate this template of the syllogistic method in terms of first premise, second premise, conclusion for the sake of synthesis, here's what it's going to look like. The first premise is going to be a statement that contains a why reason. And here's why I state it that way. Up top in the thesis, you don't get into your whys. You're just saying yes, no, or you're going to qualify. So if you're saying yes, SpongeBob does have pedagogical merit, you're going to give me a reason why in each body paragraph. So if you said yes, why are you saying yes? All right. So if you said no, why are you saying no? And if you qualified, you're going to split it. The second premise is going to be textual support. And I like to talk about the teeter-totter balance between quoting and paraphrasing. You don't want to do one so much more at the expense of the other. And conclusion is going to be your textual analysis and your links. I always tell my students that the first premise is a promise, and in the conclusion of the syllogism, so note, not the conclusion paragraph of the essay, the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, you kind of want to shake hands with that first premise and have everything come full circle, and you're going to want to hear echoes of the thesis statement in the conclusion of that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you an example of the first example of a student whose line of reasoning is broken. They're using the template of the syllogistic method, but they're going to misuse it, which is very common when you're first teaching students how to manipulate this template. And then I'll show you a syllogistic body paragraph that does it perfectly correct. So the first one's going to have some flaws and some snafus and some glitches. The second one's going to be fairly well executed. So before we take a look at the first premise of student sample number 1, let's talk about how I want that set up. The first premise should take 3 sentences to set up the focus of the argument. The College Board always says your argument must be central, and even if I'm working with non-College Board students, I always say that to them. Your argument must be central because we are writing and we're using an expository mode, which is argumentation, synthesis. So I want 3 sentences to set that up. You have to get anchored in a why reason. And in the 4th sentence, you got to transition into your textual support. So here's an example, and I've labeled it for you. So you need a why reason, and you should have like a singular, clearly articulated, clear focus reason. SpongeBob is an age-appropriate show for children ages 6 to 11. All right, so that seems clear. We're focused. Multiple tests have been done to try and prove that SpongeBob is a morally wrong program. However, the test have included children well under the targeted age group. SpongeBob is initially intended for ages 6 to 11. The only evident tests include children at the age of 4. So we're flirting at a Y reason, right? It seems to be good. I'm a little concerned about morally wrong program. I'm not sure where they're going with that. Um, I think this needs to be fleshed out a little bit. I'm not quite certain what the why reason is. Okay, above and beyond that, it's an age appropriate show for children ages 6 to 11. We haven't really gotten into the why yet. So that's a little bit of a snafu. That's a little bit of a glitch. But I'm assuming if the first premise is a promise, that the only thing we're going to talk about are these tests and how it is nonetheless an age appropriate show. So if we're going to hold true and have a clear line of reasoning, all of our textual support and all of our textual analysis is going to fall beneath the umbrella concept of that first premise. So let's see where we go. It is argued that the fast-paced television show may disrupt the child's ability to concentrate. Okay, so this is something that happens, all right, when we're using templates. Students arbitrarily quote. They quote because we tell them they need to quote. And this quote doesn't really seem to be that germane to what comes up top in that first premise. And our line of reasoning also got off here. So we're talking about fast-paced television shows. Up top in the first premise, we were talking about morally wrong programming and age-appropriate shows. So our line of reasoning's off a little bit. And the quote just seems kind of haphazardly selected. But Lawson fails to tell the readers that the study is conducted with children 2 years younger than the suggested age. With a child of appropriate age, the brain is much more mature and can handle more fast-paced programs. A 9-year-old can process the jumping around more productively than a 4-year-old based on the development of the brain. Within the fast-paced agenda of the little sponge, morals of a successful human being are illustrated to the appropriate viewers. This is all over the place. Are we talking about students or kids developing ADHD from watching this program? Are we talking about the moral lessons embodied in the program? What's the gist of what Lawson is getting at in his article? There's no clear line of reasoning here. Okay, so I'm a little bit lost. And ultimately, the result of this is because there's not a clear why reason in the first premise. So the next example, I'll show you how to do it better. So it continues. The rest of the syllogism proceeds like this. If the child is underdeveloped, the values may not be as visible, and the show may only be a large distraction. So that you can see this is oscillating in so many various directions. There's no clear line of reasoning. All television can become a distraction, however. Parents claim that television programs have a negative effect on their children's activity levels. So they're synthesizing, they drew from Lawson and Wilkins, so that's synthesizing, they're drawing from the sources. But one of the things that really needs to be taught in synthesis, and in all expository modes that require quotations, is to quote with deliberation. All of these quotes, these two quotes, seem very haphazard to me. They don't seem deliberate at all. It's quoting for the sake of quoting, for fulfilling the demands of the assignment. So this has absolutely nothing to do with the show itself. So I'm not really sure what the line of reasoning is here. It's kind of all over the place. There's about 3 things contending for prominence in this, and I'm not sure what direction this student is going. So let's see how they conclude the syllogism here. Too much television will bring down a child's activity, no matter the age or program. So yet again, we've totally switched focus again, right? We're way, way, way away from where we started. SpongeBob is not a show that increases this harm. If a child is age appropriate and has a balanced amount of activity in television, there's no problem with viewing the show. So we can see here, like, this is set up in a premise one, premise two, conclusion template, but it's like saying it's basically arguing like this: arsenic is deadly. And then in the second premise, you're talking about clam bakes, peanut butter and jelly, and toothpicks and Q-tips. It's just not aligned. You're bringing in all this extraneous stuff that's not germane to the first premise, which is, in our case, the why reason. So this is way off the mark. Just not a well-developed body paragraph at all. So the line of reasoning is greatly skewed. So let's see it done properly here. So let's get into a why reason in 3 sentences, right? The first premise is going to be a why reason that takes us 3 sentences. There are several reasons as to why parents should pull the plug on SpongeBob. First, given the intended age demographics, the show offers zero pedagogical value unless you're looking to instill the qualities of being rude and annoying. Study after study makes clear one simple fact: young children learn nothing constructive from this program. All right, that's clear. That's a clearly articulated why reason. Fourth sentence, let's get into the sources. We know in synthesis we need to pull from a few sources. So typically an assignment says, you have 5 sources, use 3, or you have 6 sources, use 4. In this one, I wanted my students to use 3 sources. So in this syllogistic body paragraph, let's see them weave some of these sources together. So fourth sentence, immediately get into your sources. In a recent study conducted by Johns Hopkins University and Mark Wilcox, they reported that the only takeaways from watching SpongeBob is the assurance that your child would become overstimulated, agitated, and negatively reinforced after watching the show for an hour. All right, that quote is germane to the first premise. That's quoting with deliberation. It's a well-selected quote. So that's something that really needs to be taught and modeled. And oftentimes what I will do is an activity called Chalk Talk, where we will go into the articles or the book that we're reading or the short story or the poem and put the quotes on the board that are, best support a first premise. So that, just model that a little bit for the students. The other thing you see here, unlike the first example, is that the quote transitions are silky smooth. They sound conversational. And there's a way to go about doing that. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words, so not exactly, but a minimum of 5 words in front of their quote, and they keep the quote small, the quote transition should sound silky smooth and conversational. And that's what happened in this one. So we're off to a good start. Let's teeter-totter balance the quoting, the paraphrasing, the analysis. So we've used Wilcox, and let's move on. Participants in the case study saw their heart rates accelerate and their eye movements shift at an alarming rate. Pam Shriver indicated, based on her own studies, that this is a surefire way to elicit ADHD in your child while erasing all of your positive child rearing. So we're synthesizing. This is good. We've used Shriver, we've used Wilcox, but let's keep everything focused on that first premise. The first premise is the promise. To establish a line of reasoning, you have to keep your promise. Everything needs to fall underneath the umbrella concept of that promise. So far, our line of reasoning is exact. One episode that illustrates these points nicely is Season 2, Episode 10. Shriver notes that within a 5-minute span, there are 348 attentional blinks, 20 times the rate of ADHD values. All right, so now we've used a couple of sources. We're weaving like 3 things together from our source material. This is perfect. We're even bringing in an episode, but this is only half of it. In this episode, SpongeBob and his friends are fiending for cigarettes and actually scheme up ways to secure a pack. Let me ask you, how is this age appropriate? What kind of pedagogy is this? I love the use of that rhetorical question. I know that some teachers are like, do not ever use a rhetorical question, but you know, I'm more liberal than that. The student has an audience. The student is writing to an audience, and we're arguing. It's a great question to ask. It makes me think, geez, yes, wow, you're making a really good argument. You're staying super cogent. You're bringing up very good evidence and very good facts. Great question to ask me. It made me pause to think. Further, Patrick, because he harbors a resentment towards SpongeBob, finds himself inflicting a massive wedgie on his friend. All right, so all of our support, all of our analysis is germane to that promise in the first premise. In the conclusion, let's hammer it home. We should hear the echo of the first premise and the echo of the thesis. I don't know about you, but I do not know many parents who are encouraging this type of behavior in their households. The bottom line is that parents need to parent and ensure that they are not being duped by an irresponsible TV babysitter. SpongeBob is not age appropriate no matter how you slice it. That is super cogent. The line of reasoning is tight on that. And the template of the syllogistic method helps produce that. So another thing that you're going to notice here, that even in sample 1 that wasn't well executed and sample 2, is that my students are not writing these itty bitty small 5-sentence body paragraphs. In order to synthesize and do it properly and to have a clear line of reasoning, I tell my students you should shoot for 10 sentences. So a syllogistic body paragraph should be about 10 sentences long, and I tell them cap it at 12, because if you exceed 12, you might just end up regurgitating the source material, get waylaid, go on a bird walk, and just get too sort of plot heavy with the source material. So that's how I teach the templates. So you've seen one good example and one that is definitely in need of revision, but I'm a firm believer that the syllogistic method definitely can help out with the line of reasoning and keeping it very cogent. So, as always, try your hand at Bob Rossing your instruction. You can definitely teach your students to write like sample B if you paint with them and provide plenty of exemplars and models. So hopefully you can use this SpongeBob synthesis essay in your class, and that you can find this writing workshop to be useful. So for now, happy teaching and happy writing.